It's been a challenging few months for Canadian business owners. When U.S. President Donald Trump came back into office earlier this year, his global trade war created an environment of uncertainty. Now, Canada hasn't had to face the sweeping tariffs that other countries have seen. But Canadian small businesses are still getting hit by the effects of the trade war. And something that's having a major impact are U.S. tariffs targeting China. Mariya Postelnyak reports on consumer affairs for The Globe. Today, she's here to talk about how Canadian small business owners are getting caught in trade disputes between the U.S. and China, how they've been preparing for these disruptions, and what all this means for their ability to survive. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms, and this is The Decibel from The Globe and Mail. Mariya, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So between the U.S. tariff threats, uncertainty around Canada Post, and a potential looming recession now, I know it's been a tough few months for Canadian businesses. What are you actually hearing from small business owners?
Well, small business owners are really in survival mode right now. They've been through a series of setbacks, one after the other in the past few years, with some of them telling me that, they're still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that's had on global supply chains. I think about 14% had considered bankruptcy in 2022. And then now we have Donald Trump threatening sweeping tariffs as high as 25% a few months ago. And although there's been some reprieve on that, they're still facing tons of uncertainty.
Okay, so it seems like lots of uncertainty, especially in the last little while. And of course, Canada has seen targeted tariffs from the U.S., but we had been spared the more general tariffs that a lot of countries are facing. However, Canadian companies are still getting caught up in the crosshairs when it comes to U.S. tariffs on China somehow. This is actually a really interesting thing. This has something to do with the de minimis exemption, Mariya. Can you explain for us, what exactly is that?
So de minimis is a Latin term that translates along the lines of the least significance. So the de minimis exemption itself, it's a rule that allows packages of a certain small or insignificant value to enter a country duty-free. So many countries have some sort of a de minimis exemption. For example, Canada sets ours at $150 for countries like the US, but you may actually still need to pay taxes like GST and HST on packages valued at $40 or higher. The U.S., which is this enormous market for businesses, has a de minimis exemption for packages valued at $800 or less, which means that those packages can enter the country duty-free.
Okay, so this is like the average person ordering clothes online or something. If it's under that threshold, $800 in the U.S., $150 in Canada, it sounds like, then you're okay. You're not paying extra duties on that. Exactly.
And it's important to note that in 2016, the U.S. raised their de minimis exemption from $200 to $800. And that's what really allowed a lot of businesses, big and small, to not just grow, but thrive. One business owner I spoke with, Blair Nadeau, who runs a bridal accessories e-commerce store, she has about 85 to 90% of her business coming from the U.S. And so she's really built her entire business model around this exemption.
Okay, so this is really interesting. This is basically allowing for the free trade of goods for small amounts, kind of when, people are buying things themselves. They're not going to get hit with massive tariffs or anything.
Exactly.
What's happened with this exemption in the U.S. through the course of this trade war that we've seen over the last few months?
So starting around February, Donald Trump began threatening to get rid of the de minimis exemption for a number of countries importing small value parcels into the U.S., including Canada. And that's when small business owners like Blair were just, holding their breath. She said removing the exemption for Canada would have been catastrophic for her business, since a majority of her orders use that exemption. Eventually, Donald Trump ended duty-free entry for Chinese goods alone. So this was also during the same time as Washington and Beijing were sort of playing tariff tag and taking turns imposing these mind-bogglingly high duties on one another. Most recently, the U.S. had a 145% tariff on China, and then China imposed a 125% tariff on the U.S. At the same time, the U.S. had a 120% tariff on de minimis packages coming from China. So the duty for those was a bit different. Obviously, things were getting out of hand. And in early May, the leaders of the two countries, they instated this 90-day truce, which we have now. Tariffs were still in place, but they were much lower. For commercial shipments, the U.S. now has a 30% tariff on China instead of the 145%. But for de minimis packages, that 120% tariff slipped to 54%.
Okay. Just so I understand, so the U.S. still has these tariffs now then on direct-to-consumer goods coming in from China. So that 800 de minimis exemption, anything coming in from China, doesn't count anymore. So for Americans who are ordering clothing online, like I think of a company like Shein or something, what does that mean for them?
So for U.S. customers ordering from Temu, Shein, that usually means seeing a higher price point at checkout. It's not always necessarily the full amount of the tariff, as some businesses might absorb some of that, but definitely a large chunk. There was actually a recent analysis from an American publication of Shein prices in early May, and that found that prices were on average higher, about 43% on a sample of 300 women's apparel items. But actually, a separate report also found that Shein prices had grown as much as 377% for some items.
Okay, so American consumers are really seeing a difference then.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Let's come back to this question then of how Canadian companies are affected by the tariffs on China. So even though the de minimis exemption for Canada remains intact, the U.S. tariffs on China are still affecting Canadian companies. How is that happening, Mariya?
So there are a few ways that this might be happening. The first is that a lot of Canadian businesses use some materials from China, which means that they might also face the same or similar penalties as if their product came directly from China, according to customs brokers I spoke with. This will depend on a few different factors, like how much raw materials from China were transformed in Canada when that product or that material arrived, and also what value of the product came from China. So let's say you're a rubber rug company. If imported materials like rubber from China make up a significant portion of your product's value, or if the product underwent a substantial transformation before entering Canada, you'll likely still face similar hurdles as if you were sending from China directly to the U.S.
Okay, so if these companies are bringing products in from China and integrating that into their goods, they're getting hit there. Are there any, workarounds or options they have to kind of minimize the hit they take?
Well, Steve Bozicevic, one of the customs brokers I spoke with, he said that companies need to get creative. For example, when the issue is value, some businesses can lower supplier costs, they can blend imported and local materials, or they can increase production costs in Canada, even by doing things as, sounding outrageous as, giving a raise to your employees, because that actually increases production complexity and costs in Canada. Then you say, okay, well, my manufacturing costs increased by 20% in Canada, so the value of the product goes up.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, so if you increase the value of what's being done in Canada, that decreases the value of the Chinese component.
Exactly, or the proportion of the value.
Okay, so it sounds like if you've got a product that's being shipped to the U.S., but it has some components that came from China, you could still be hit with this then.
Exactly. But the second problem, though, is that companies that have no ties to China whatsoever are still facing delays. They're still being confronted with this chaos at the border. They're, up against longer verification process by customs border officers. Their packages are getting torn open. Things are getting verified because the officers at the border are obviously looking for failure. So nobody really gets away from this unscathed.
Can you explain that a little bit more? When you say the verification process at the border, what exactly is happening there?
Well, for example, one of the business owners I spoke with, Blair Nadeau, she needed to create stickers, made in Canada labels, add hang tags, provide a certificate of origin, provide details about the manufacturing information, even of the product. All that has to be included for every separate package, which has essentially taken what used to be a 2-minute packing process for one, order to the US into a 20-minute process. It's added about 15 minutes in addition to all the other documents that she needs to find, all the other paperwork she needs to file. So it's really added additional costs, but also just time that businesses need to take.
So it sounds like because there's now this additional scrutiny at the border, Canadian companies are having to go through this process of really proving that these products are from Canada then.
Exactly. I think Blair and a few others I spoke with, they're also considering going to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce to just get a special certificate that helps move things along. But these are additional headaches that these small businesses need to tackle on their own. They often don't have the same resources as large companies. So you can understand what kind of problems that would create.
We'll be back in a moment. So, Mariya, we've been talking about the kinds of changes that Canadian businesses are dealing with. Do we know practically what all of that looks like at the border?
Absolutely. One of the spokespeople for Chit Chats, which is this shipping company specializing in e-commerce deliveries, one of the spokespeople I spoke with, she said that the situation at the border was just pure chaos. They had a whole truckload of their goods turned around at one point because the packages, they weren't properly declared. And since that time, they've had to work with customers to make sure they had all the proper documentation, to make sure that their package is either not turned away and can get through the border, or they'll have to not ship it out for the time being. And actually, what was interesting is that a lot of businesses specializing in vintage or antique goods, many of those had to stop delivering entirely because it was often impossible to get all the manufacturing information, all the kind of details about the product's origin. So they've stopped operating entirely.
Wow. So bottom line, it sounds like even though Canadian goods may not be hit directly by certain tariffs, there's still a lot of impact that's happening here.
Exactly.
So, Mariya, it does sound like things are changing often here, and it's got to be really challenging for business owners to constantly respond to these different shifts. What have they been doing in Canada to prepare for all of this unpredictability?
So one thing that a lot of businesses have been doing is stockpiling these giant heaps of excess inventory from both the U.S. and elsewhere around the world in preparation for any possible future U.S. tariffs on Canada and any possible counter tariffs that Canada might put in place. Actually, a February survey from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business found that about 13% of their members were stockpiling these products as one strategy to kind of mitigate any future harm.
Okay. So when we say stockpiling, can you give us some examples? What does this actually look like?
Yeah, for sure. So they're renting new warehouse space across Canada, paying often, hundreds of thousands additional dollars to bring inventory in truckloads and, just make sure that they have enough product in case there's any new tariffs that come into place. I'll give an example of Leah Corin. She's the owner of Essence of Elle in White Rock, BC. She had to put tens of thousands of dollars in cash upfront to stock up on perishable ingredients and compounds for her cosmetics. Okay, so trying to get basically these ingredients into the country and ready to go in case those prices go up then at some point. Exactly. As one warehouse operator I spoke with put it, he said that, there's always going to be someone who would take your market share if you're not flexible. So what if the tariffs that they have feared did come into play, then those companies would have a harder time becoming nimble and adapting. So this is just a risk that they're taking to make sure that they're prepared. Okay. So one of the risks sounds like, for sure, an extra cost at having to basically house these products for so long. Are there other risks to the business in stockpiling in this way? Well, a lot of the goods that these companies are stockpiling are perishable goods. So, for example, Ashley Chapman, the chief operating officer at Chapman's Ice Cream, he needed to spend thousands to rent extra warehouse storage space to stockpile hundreds of pallets of Georgia pecans, cherries, all the good stuff.
All the ice cream ingredients, basically.
Exactly. They're the most popular flavors they have for sure. And Donald Trump, obviously very unpredictable, regularly shifts course on tariffs. So Canada actually ended up being largely spared in the latest round of sweeping duties on global trade partners that Donald Trump had announced on April 2nd, which also meant that they were spared from a possible second round of counter tariffs that Canada was aiming to put in place. So now Ashley Chapman rented all this space, brought all this product in, and it's sort of unnecessary for him.
Wow.
He could have saved that money for all the other uncertainties he might face.
And now he's got all of these perishable goods that are sitting in this warehouse that he's paying a lot of money for.
Exactly.
And something else that I imagine is on these business owners' minds is the uncertainty with Canada Post right now, because workers are not on strike, but they aren't working overtime. And that means delivery for lots of items could be delayed. So, Mariya, what kind of impact could this have on small businesses who are already dealing with the effects of this trade war?
Well, the Canada Post strike is just another hit in a series of blows that businesses have been facing. And for many, it's really sending them over the edge. It could be the final nail in the coffin.
The potential of a strike, essentially, yeah.
Exactly. So, for example, one business I spoke with, Vesey's Seeds, they're a mail order gardening company. They said that the really devastating losses that they faced during the last postal strike, which saw them lose, I think, 6,000 to 7,000 orders and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of their business, they're now making sure that, no matter what happens with Canada Post, they're prepared. They had to switch to a private courier, and that added about 10 to 15% additional cost on their business. So businesses have already had to front capital in order to make sure that they're prepared and switch to these other companies.
Just another thing they're trying to prepare for then.
Exactly, yeah.
Very lastly here, Mariya, before I let you go, it does seem like there is a lot of uncertainty for Canadian small businesses right now. We keep saying this word because it seems to kind of encapsulate the feeling here. How serious could all of this uncertainty be for business owners?
So all of this is really testing the limits of how much business margins can be squeezed and just how much companies can adapt before it becomes just kind of either useless or to the detriment of their business. A KPMG survey released in February when the new tariffs on China were just introduced, it showed that about 90% of surveyed business leaders said they had or they were at least considering diverting goods to countries not facing tariffs. That was in February, but since April, almost every country in the world has become subject to a minimum 10% tariff on imports to the U.S. So that just shows that, shifting supply chains in this highly volatile and uncertain environment, that can sometimes prove to be dubious or just plain risky. My colleague Pippa Norman, actually, she recently spoke to the Canadian business owner of a company making model trains. He had about 75%, so a majority of his business in the U.S., and he explained that diversifying from China as a manufacturing base, it's something that they considered, but it doesn't make sense financially.
So he's a Canadian company, but his trains are made in China then?
Exactly.
And then sold in the U.S. primarily?
Sold in the U.S. 75% of his clients are in the U.S. So it just didn't make sense for their business. There are a handful of North American model train manufacturers, but they just don't, have the same degree of detail. And manufacturing in China is just so much less expensive and more efficient that this is not something that, it would benefit them to move it elsewhere. He's been calling the situation a sort of doomsday scenario for business. And I think that reflects how many small businesses are feeling as well.
Yeah. Mariya, thank you so much for your reporting on this and for taking the time to be here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Mariya Postelnyak, the Globe's consumer affairs reporter. That's it for today. I'm Menaka Raman-Wilms. Our intern is Kelsey Howlett. Our associate producer is Aja Souter. Our producers are Madeline White, Michal Stein, and Ali Graham. David Crosby edits the show. Adrian Chung is our senior producer, and Matt Freiner is our managing editor. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.